It's crazy, isn't it? Like you go through your day, everything feels normal, and then bam, you get a news alert that reminds you just how powerful Mother Nature can be.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Like this morning, the news about this earthquake in Myanmar, it's huge. A magnitude 7.7, and the aftershocks, the impact. It's reaching way further than you might expect.
Definitely a significant event. And, it's exactly the kind of thing we like to unpack here. Give everyone a better understanding of what's going on.
Exactly, a deep dive. And for this one, we're relying on reporting from BBC News. They seem to have some of the most up-to-date information on this earthquake in Myanmar. So what we really want to do is get a good grasp on what happened, the effects, both close to the epicenter and further away, and what the early assessments are looking like. Okay, so the first earthquake hit at 06.20 GMT, a powerful 7.7 magnitude. And get this, just 10 minutes later, a 6.4 magnitude aftershock. Both of these were centered near Mandalay in Myanmar. But here's the really surprising part. People reported feeling the tremors over 1,000 miles away in Thailand and even parts of China.
Yeah, that's what's so fascinating about earthquakes of this size. I mean, the energy released is just enormous. It travels through the earth as these seismic waves, and even a quake that's shallow, well, even far from the epicenter, it can create those surface waves that travel these huge distances, and you definitely still feel them.
Right. So thinking about that travel distance, the ripples spreading out, it makes me think of dropping a rock in a pond, you know? Like the bigger the rock, the further those ripples go.
Exactly.
So focusing in on Myanmar first, it looks like the epicenter was really close to Mandalay. The BBC mentions this city called, well, they say it two ways, either Saran or Ceylon. Either way, it happened around 12:50 p.m. local time there, which lines up with that SU6550 GMT time we mentioned.
Right. And another thing that's crucial to consider is that the depth was reported to be about 10 kilometers.
Oh, well, okay.
And remember, we've talked about this before, but a shallower earthquake tends to be way more damaging at the surface. Since the energy doesn't have to travel as far, it doesn't dissipate as much. So it hits with a lot more force right where people live and where all the infrastructure is.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And speaking of that, we're already starting to see images from Myanmar and, well, things aren't looking good. The BBC has pictures of what looks like serious damage to a main road. And that immediately makes you think, how are they going to get aid to people if the roads are damaged?
Absolutely. Those transportation rights are essential in a disaster like this. And honestly, it's not surprising that we haven't seen confirmed casualty figures from Myanmar just yet. Getting reliable information from the epicenter right after a big earthquake is always tough.
Yeah, of course.
I mean, think about it. Communication networks can be down. It's hard to access the area because of the damage. It all takes time.
That's true. But we have had a few reports coming through. AFP journalists in Naypyidaw, that's the capital city, it's about 100 kilometers south of where the earthquake hit. And they're seeing roads buckling, even chunks of ceiling falling inside buildings.
Wow.
So that really shows you how strong this earthquake was, even that far away.
Definitely. I mean, 100 kilometers and still causing that kind of damage, that's a lot of force traveling through the ground. It's a good illustration of how the initial rupture, that energy, spreads outwards.
And there's another report the BBC picked up on, circulating on social media. It sounds pretty serious. Apparently, a large bridge near Mandalay has collapsed into the Irrawaddy River. If that's true, that would be a huge problem, wouldn't it?
Oh, yeah, for sure. A bridge collapsing, well, that's a major piece of infrastructure gone. Imagine the impact on transportation, rescue efforts, everything. It really highlights how vulnerable our structures are when you have these big seismic events.
For sure. Okay, so now let's switch gears to Bangkok, Thailand, because this is where the news takes a kind of a scary turn. So according to the BBC, people in Bangkok felt those tremors really strongly, so strongly that people were heading out into the streets. I mean, I get it. You feel that shaking, you're going to be worried.
You would be, yeah. And I mean, for an earthquake centered in Myanmar to have such a strong impact all the way in Bangkok, that's pretty incredible. Shows you how far those seismic waves can travel and still pack a punch.
And there was this one detail that really stuck with me. Apparently, the shaking was so intense that water in a skyscraper swimming pool in Bangkok actually splashed over the sides. I mean, can you imagine?
Wow.
That's a crazy image, right?
It really is. I mean, it just gives you a sense of how much the ground must have been moving, even hundreds of miles from the earthquake itself. It might not cause as much structural damage at that distance, but that movement, especially in a tall building, it's going to be noticeable.
Oh, yeah. But then came the news that really grabbed everyone's attention. AFP and Reuters are reporting that there's been a building collapse in Bangkok.
Oh, no.
At least 43 workers are trapped inside.
That's awful.
Yeah, and the BBC said that AFP is reporting that the building was a 30-story skyscraper that was still under construction.
Oh, wow. That's a major incident, even if the earthquake was so far away. I mean, it really brings home the fact that powerful earthquakes can have these far-reaching consequences, especially in places like Bangkok with lots of tall buildings, lots of people. And the fact that it was under construction, well, that does make you wonder about how stable it was in the first place.
Exactly. And the BBC pointed out something interesting. They said, we're probably seeing more images and reports from Bangkok right now, just because there's a much bigger social media presence there and a more developed news network compared to the area around the epicenter in Myanmar.
Right, right. That's really important to keep in mind when you're following breaking news. You're not always getting the full picture right away, and it often depends on things like communication technology and access to media. Just because one area is slower to report doesn't mean it wasn't hit just as hard.
Totally. And speaking of firsthand accounts, the BBC team that's actually in Bangkok, they felt the shaking too. They described buildings swaying, said it felt dizzying. That's pretty wild.
Yeah, wow. So even being that far away, it was still strong enough to cause that kind of sensation. And tragically, it was strong enough to cause a building collapse.
Exactly. It's no wonder the Thai government called an emergency meeting.
Of course. In a situation like this, you need a quick and coordinated response from the government. Get those rescue efforts going, figure out the extent of the damage, help the people who've been affected. All of that is crucial.
Absolutely. And the BBC mentioned that people in Bangkok are actually pretty aware of the risks of earthquakes. They even do evacuation drills. Hopefully that preparedness will help them cope with the situation.
It really could make a big difference. Having that public awareness, knowing what to do in an earthquake, that can absolutely help to prevent injuries and make the whole response more effective.
Absolutely. So taking a step back, we're talking about tremors being felt in Thailand, parts of China. That's a huge area affected by this earthquake.
It is. I mean, to give you an idea of the scale here, the USGS, they classify a 7.7 magnitude earthquake as major. It's definitely a powerful event, and those can cause widespread, significant damage, especially if they're shallow, which this one was. And to put things in perspective even further, the magnitude scale, well, every time you go up a whole number, it represents about a 10-fold increase in the amplitude of those seismic waves. And even more so, it's a 32-fold increase in the energy released, so a 7.7. That's a lot more energy than, say, a 6.4.
Wow. Okay. That really puts things in perspective. And like we talked about earlier, that shallow depth really makes a big difference.
Absolutely. If the energy doesn't have to travel as far to reach the surface, it's much more concentrated. And that means stronger shaking, a greater chance of damage.
Makes sense. And on that note,
Yeah.
it's pretty clear that getting good information and aid to the epicenter in Myanmar, that's going to be a challenge.
Unfortunately, that's often the case after a major earthquake, especially in a region that might have damaged infrastructure, communication problems, remote areas. It can be really difficult to coordinate those relief efforts. That's where international support becomes really important.
Right. So let's try to sum all of this up. A really powerful 7.7 magnitude earthquake hit central Myanmar, followed by another strong aftershock. Early reports from Myanmar show road damage, a possible bridge collapse. But the most immediate news, the most dramatic, is coming from Bangkok. That skyscraper collapse with those trapped workers, that's a serious situation.
Yeah. And it's so important to remember that in these early stages, we're only getting a partial picture. Right now, most of what we're seeing is coming from where it's easiest to get information. As communication gets restored, access to Myanmar improves, we'll start to get a better understanding of the situation there.
I think that's a really good point. Things are still developing, and we're likely to learn a lot more in the coming hours and days. But it really makes you think, doesn't it, about how connected our world is. This earthquake happened in Myanmar, but it's having these huge effects thousands of miles away in Thailand. It makes you think about how vulnerable we are to events like this and how important it is to be prepared not just in our own communities, but on a global scale. I mean, what does it really mean when an event can have such a huge impact so far away? That's something to think about.
Definitely.
That's all the time we have for today. Be sure to check back in for updates and further analysis as the story continues to develop. Stay safe, everyone.